Every gambler knows that the secret to surviving.
I don't wanna take advice from fools.
You always won every time you placed a bet.
That's what I want.
March Madness, college basketball handicapping. I'm Joe Duffy, America's only Grandmaster sports handicapper and CEO of OffshoreInsiders.com. Over the years, we've written many articles and recorded podcasts exposing betting urban legends. We warn you about the guards' dominated inductive non-thinking. In football articles, we enlighten gamblers of the truth that applies to all ATS sports gambling. Actual straight-up wins and losses have little bearing on handicapping. And our article about how great offensive teams win big games was an epiphany for many of you. Now, Peter Torina, who was then of ESPN, and from now on I'm going to call him just Peter T. May have screwed up your name, Peter. I do apologize, but he now has his own website, Bracket Science. He's written a series of articles that are, quote-unquote, the top 10 indicators of overachievement in men's basketball NCAA tournament, as well as the bottom 5, or more accurately stated, the top 5 indicators of underachievement. Frankly, little we read surprised us. Using objective numbers, he measured performance against seed expectations. That's what he calls it, and it is PACE for short, P-A-S-E, which simply put is a study of how often the higher seeded team wins and what factors are the most common when the lower seeded teams wins. Now, clients know that at OffshoreInsiders.com and God's Tips going back to my scorephone days as JD of the ACC, Units 1 is the most accurate way to measure a gambling system rather than winning percentage because it takes into sample size very much into that consideration. We've had decades of experience to prove that is the most statistically reliable way to measure data. Now, in this case, Peter T. ranks the attributes based on what he calls PACE, as we said, performance against seeded expectations. At least from a handicapping standpoint, much like above at God's Tips, anchor of OffshoreInsiders.com, we've considered actual plus-minus wins to be the higher confidence level. And that's what he does on his quote-unquote PACE. Thus, I have used the ESPN data when I first discovered this confirmation, and now, as we said, at Bracket Science, so it based different statistical confidence using a different criterion. Now, here is a news flash. Most gamblers lose, being a little facetious there. In a related note, the overwhelming belief that defense wins championships and big games. We have told you time and time again, defensive intensity rises in the postseason, making teams that can score big and tough baskets considerably more important. When Richard Dawson, where is Richard Dawson when you need him? Survey says teams that average scoring 3 points or more than a tournament field are plus 46.8 victories. It's no surprise to us because that it is the highest plus-minus in the study using a single attribute. In other words, teams that are able to get points do very well in the NCAA tournament. Mercy me! Guess what the worst plus-minus in the field is? Teams that have a points allowed per game below the normal tournament field average or minus 33.6 wins. Thus, statistically dominant defensive teams actually disappoint in the NCAA tournament. Surprise to a lot of you, not a surprise to any of our long-term clients that go back to our scorephone days and have been clients of God's Tips on OffshoreInsiders.com for quite a few years. Now, the short of it is, the biggest victim of upsets, superior defenses. Again, folks, the biggest victim of upsets, according to this study, confirmed, and we've said it for years, teams with superior defenses. The biggest culprits of pulling off upsets? Superior offenses. Luckily for us, the subsidized books gaming public believes it's the polar opposite. That's why those beautiful casinos get built. That's why there are so many offshore as well as brick-and-mortar sports books that are doing well. Not to mention the local guy, which has been brought back thanks to the war on gambling, but that's another story for another time. Now, teams with a margin of victory of 15 points or more had 244.7 quote-unquote expected wins, but 288 more actual wins, which is a plus 43.3 wins ratio. Margin is so much more accurate than wins and losses because luck plays no small part in winning or losing close games, but margin of victory validates a team's true strength. Of course, from a gambler standpoint, margin of victory is everything. I repeat, straight-up wins and losses are the most overrated statistic in all of sports handicapping when we're talking about basketball and football, where we're actually picking the spread, not the straight-up winner. Peter T. then did a follow-up article on, quote-unquote, attribute pairings. That is simply when combining two factors, what the results were. Of course, because fewer games would be involved, by and large, the plus-minus numbers were not as high as when only one factor was needed because, as we said, in this case, you're going to need two factors to qualify. However, pace scorings were generally higher. The highest pace of them all is at .509. It says teams that got more than 60% of the scoring from their front court and at least one preseason All-American win the most disproportionate rate relative to seeds. So again, the teams that pull off the most upset, teams that are top heavy scoring in the front court. Again, we have said so many times before, even before we discovered this validation, there is the myth of guard-oriented teams do well in the NCAA tournament. That is balderdash. Now, like we said, so many teams have quality backcourts. There are so few teams, though, that have top-level front courts. But those teams that do will do very well, advancing in the dance and do very well spread-wise. Now, the attribute pairings, in a modest surprise, did, though, produce the highest plus-minus. Teams with more than 4 straight tournament bids and a one-game losing streak entering the tournament had 207.6 expected wins, but 258 actual wins, which is a plus 50.4 margin. Be warned, the data takes a lot of time to synthesize, parse, and then kind of translate it to sports betting, which we corroborate with the information that we have. Perhaps a betting alternative is to find a professional handicapper who does all the work for you, such as, conveniently enough, www.offshoreinsiders.com. All the best handicappers, why don't you go to that and see what makes us number one. Click on that link at the top of the page, what makes us number one, and you will see why offshoreinsiders.com is the official sports handicapping site of professional gamblers. Again, www.offshoreinsiders.com.